Hello, folks. Okay, this time around, I just want to briefly introduce the idea of design patterns. We're just going to kind of touch on this, give you some ideas, and you'll probably get into this in a lot more detail in the object-oriented course, 331. So the concept of design patterns kind of evolved from practices in OO design, but the ideas, the concepts themselves, are much more widely applicable than just that. So the basic idea is that there are a few common styles of problem or system in software design, and so we can come up with a kind of common pattern for a solution. If you like, a much more abstract template for how we're going to approach certain kinds of problems. And we associate names with those so that when we're talking with other developers, we can say, okay, well, I think this kind of falls into this sort of a pattern, which means we might be able to use this kind of a solution. So it gives us a common starting point for explaining some of the problems and solutions that are out there. So there's a lot of projects, a lot of tools that support standardized frameworks for patterns and templates for patterns that are frequently encountered. So this is something that it helps to be aware of. So it's often possible to go through and express a particular problem in multiple different ways. And one of the things that you can do to start getting some ideas for solutions to a problem is to suggest a few different design patterns as starting points. If we try and express the problem that we've got right now using this pattern, then it might suggest we could use this sort of a solution. Or if we express our problem right now in this kind of a pattern, that might suggest this kind of a solution. So we can use these as starting points for directions to explore for solutions. Now, you're often going to find that because our systems are fairly complex, there are often ways to describe them from the point of view of different patterns, more than one possible pattern to describe a particular scenario, just depending on sort of our perspective. And so you're going to look at the problem that you've got and the different patterns it might fit and how that might influence what your solution is going to look like. So an awful lot of problems are going to require sort of a customization of a specific pattern or a combination of a bunch of different patterns, and you kind of blend them together in the way that makes the most sense. Now, again, the idea is this is a possible starting point for design. You don't want to become so obsessed on picking a pattern that you start kind of trying to shoehorn something into a pattern that it doesn't really fit, where you become more focused on making the problem fit the pattern than on actually finding a good solution for the problem at hand. So you do have to use this with common sense, but it can be a really valuable tool. So there are a lot of groups of patterns and a lot of different specific patterns that you'll look at over the years. I'm just going to very quickly introduce a few at a superficial level here. Some of the ideas are there are sort of the broad collection of creational patterns where you're interested in your problem is to create an object or instantiate something. So we'll take a look at singleton patterns in a couple of moments and just briefly talk about those. But the idea is, quite often you're in a situation where you have to create something, right? Obviously, where as your program goes along, it has to create, whether it's a new window or a new this or a new that or a new something or other. So this can become one of the patterns that appears in your program or in your solution. We can look at structural patterns that deal with how we'll organize different components together. How can we organize other classes, other objects into a more complex structure to provide the functionality that we want? So we'll look at the idea of adapter patterns, where we're sort of translating between something and something else, right? Where we've got an old class and a new class, and we're translating between them, for instance, if we think back to our refactoring ideas. Or we might look at behavioral patterns, where we're dealing with where our pattern deals with the way two different objects communicate with one another or interact with one another. So we'll look at iterators in a moment, or the idea of command patterns. So there are broad categories of pattern as well as the specific individual patterns that we'll play with. just to look at a few specific examples, just really quickly to get some of the ideas across. You might have something like a singleton pattern, where you've got some class that there can only be one of when your program is running. So you've got some controller, for instance, that dictates everything during the run of your program. Something that there can only be one instance of. Right? Or an adapter pattern. So this is a pattern that we might use where we're trying to convert the interface for one class so that it's compatible with that of another. So you've got these two classes that need to talk to one another, but they're not really set up in a way to make that suitable directly. So we come up with an adapter pattern to sort of sit in the middle and translate between them, to adapt one for the other. Or the idea of iterator patterns, where we've got something that represents a collection of objects, and we want some way to cycle through all the items in that collection, all the objects in that collection, right? Something that gives us a way to traverse all of the data elements in some bigger collection or structure. So again, lots of different ideas for typical kinds of patterns. I will leave the exploration of those for other courses, but you should be aware of the concept and aware of the ideas, and maybe start looking into common design patterns that are out there. Good stuff for future thoughts.